Okay, so you want to build a financial empire in medieval Europe. You have zero land, no royal lineage, and no military battalion. But you do notice something extraordinary. Millions of desperate believers across the continent are willing to spend their life savings for a single glance at a piece of wood, a fragment of cloth, or a splinter of human bone. There is just one massive problem. Sacred canon law explicitly forbids you from making a single penny off holy objects. Under the terrifying doctrine of simony, buying or selling sacred relics is declared a mortal sin. Do it, and you do not just face execution by the secular courts. You face eternal damnation in the fiery depths of hell, endorsed by the highest religious authorities on earth. So how on earth did medieval monasteries, rogue merchants, and papal elites transform a forbidden trade into a multi-billion-dollar empire that built cathedral skylines, funded wars, and established Europe's very first global tourism infrastructure? Welcome to the shadowy, hyper-profitable mechanics of the medieval relic trade, where holy law said no, but human desperation and legal loopholes said absolutely yes. To understand how this massive economic machinery operated, you first have to dismantle the holy myth. When you picture a medieval church displaying the arm bone of a saint or a piece of the true cross, you probably imagine pious monks receiving humble gifts from passing pilgrims. You think of a quiet, solemn house of prayer surviving on voluntary alms. That is the illusion. The reality was a high-stakes, ruthless corporate enterprise. The medieval relic trade was not a side business. It was the central engine of the entire feudal economy. If your monastery owned a primary relic, like the preserved finger of St. Peter or the skull of John the Baptist, you were not just running a house of worship. You were running the equivalent of a modern deep-sea oil rig, pumping liquid gold out of thin air. In the 13th century, King Louis IX of France purchased the crown of thorns from the Emperor of Constantinople for the astronomical sum of 135,000 livres. To put that in perspective, that single transaction cost more than half of the entire annual budget of the French crown. Building Sainte-Chapelle, the magnificent Gothic royal chapel constructed specifically to house the crown of thorns, cost less than 20% of what Louis spent buying the relic itself. The container was cheap. The spiritual real estate was priceless. But if buying and selling these items was strictly illegal under church law, how did King Louis hand over bags of silver without burning in hell? And how did ordinary shrines turn dried bones into daily cash flow? You think they directly sold the sacred bone? Wrong. Cross that out immediately. That would be simony, and simony gets you excommunicated. Instead, medieval legal minds invented the ultimate financial loophole. You never sell the holy object. You sell the experience, the container, and the proximity. When a monastery wanted to raise capital, they did not sell the saint's arm bone. They placed the bone inside an exquisitely crafted reliquary made of 2 pounds of solid gold, studded with sapphires and emeralds. Then, they sold the reliquary. In the legal documentation, the buyer was paying for the gold, the silver, and the artistic craftsmanship of the goldsmith. The holy bone inside? Oh, that was just a free gift included in the transaction. This legal fiction allowed millions of coins to flow directly into monastic treasuries, while keeping theologians satisfied that no divine substance had technically been assigned a dollar value. But selling relics wholesale was only for extreme financial emergencies. The real sustainable billions came from retail monetization. To capture this cash flow, medieval institutions built a system that modern tech companies can only envy: total vertical integration of the spiritual experience. Imagine you are a medieval peasant. Your harvest failed, your child is sick, or you are terrified of spending 10,000 years in purgatory. The church tells you that traveling to the shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela or St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury will cleanse your soul. You pack your bags and start walking. But the moment you step foot on the pilgrimage highway, you enter a carefully orchestrated economic meat grinder. Monasteries along the route constructed toll bridges, private roads, and specialized inns. You paid to cross the bridge. You paid for a bed in the hostel. You paid for bread baked in the monastery's ovens. And when you finally arrived at the cathedral, you paid an entry fee just to stand in the line that led to the crypt. Once inside the cathedral walls, the monetization escalated. You were not allowed to touch the relic directly. That would be sacrilege. Instead, church attendants offered you a bronze or lead badge, stamped with the image of the saint. You paid copper coins for this tiny metal token. Why? Because by touching the badge against the glass reliquary housing the saint's remains, spiritual energy was believed to transfer into the metal. You were buying a physical storage device for divine grace. Millions of these lead badges were produced in mass production molds, generating profit margins of over 900%. Monasteries had created the world's first branded merchandise, and every single pilgrim became a walking billboard for the shrine upon returning to their home village. Let us pause for a second. You might be asking yourself, what happened when a monastery did not have a famous saint? What if your church was broke, located in a remote village, and had no holy bones to draw in the lucrative tourist trade? Did you just sit there and go bankrupt? Absolutely not. You hired a relic broker, or worse, you orchestrated a pious robbery. In the medieval business world, this was known as Furta Sacra, the holy theft. Consider the legendary case of the town of Bari in southern Italy in the year 1087. Bari was facing economic ruin due to shifting trade routes and political instability. Meanwhile, the city of Myra in modern-day Turkey held the remains of Saint Nicholas, the beloved holy figure who would eventually inspire Santa Claus. A group of Italian merchants and sailors sailed to Myra, broke into the saint's tomb under cover of night, overpowered the local guardians, and smashed open the sarcophagus. They hauled the bones back to Bari. But here is the brilliant narrative twist that completely bypassed criminal law. When the merchants arrived home, they did not hide the stolen goods. They threw a massive parade. The local archbishop publicly blessed the thieves. The official church narrative was framed instantly. Saint Nicholas had appeared to the merchants in a vision, complaining that he was bored in Myra and desperately wanted his bones moved to Bari. The theft was transformed into a divine rescue mission. Within months of Saint Nicholas arriving in Bari, the town's economy exploded. Thousands of wealthy pilgrims flooded the port city. Donations poured in so fast that construction immediately began on the giant basilica of Saint Nicholas. The stolen bones had saved the entire municipal economy. This success story triggered a gold rush of sacred burglaries across Western Europe. Monks dressed in dark cloaks slipped out of their monasteries at midnight, crossed borders, broke into competitor shrines, and dug up holy corpses. If your heist succeeded, you did not get arrested. You got promoted to abbot because everyone agreed that if the saint had not wanted to be stolen, the saint would have performed a miracle to stop you. As competition for pilgrim gold intensified throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, market supply faced a severe bottleneck. There were only so many original apostles and martyrs from the early Roman era. Demand was infinite, but authentic supply was strictly limited. How did medieval relic merchants solve this economic bottleneck? They created the single largest counterfeit market in human history. If you conducted an inventory of medieval European churches in the 14th century, the statistical math was utterly absurd. At one point, there were at least 12 different full skulls of St. John the Baptist being displayed in different cathedrals across Europe, each claiming undisputed authenticity. When confronted with this bizarre anomaly, church guides did not panic. They had an answer ready for curious tourists. One skull was St. John when he was an adult, and another was St. John when he was a young boy. Theology was effortlessly bent to protect profit margins. There were enough pieces of the true cross scattered across European altars to construct a timber fleet of wooden battleships. There were vials of holy milk from the Virgin Mary, feathers dropped from the wings of the Archangel Gabriel, and even the preserved breath of St. Joseph trapped inside sealed glass bottles. Specialist artisan workshops in Venice, Constantinople, and Nuremberg worked around the clock manufacturing antique-looking bones, aging parchment tags, and carving fake ivory caskets. Venice became the ultimate clearinghouse for international relic forgery. Venetian merchants bought animal bones from local butcher shops, boiled them in fragrant wine and aromatic oils to give them an ancient, holy scent, packed them into ornate crystal vials, and sold them to naive German princes and French noblemen for fortunes in silver. To maximize profits, the market developed complex tier artifact hierarchy. First-class relics were actual body parts of a saint: a finger, a tooth, an entire leg. Second-class relics were items the saint had directly touched during their lifetime, such as a robe, a sandal, or an iron chain. Third-class relics were items that had merely come into physical contact with a first-class or second-class relic. This third tier was where the ultimate financial leverage lived. A monastery with one single authentic first-class relic could produce an infinite supply of third-class relics at virtually zero cost. Monks simply touched pieces of cheap linen cloth to the original bone, cut the cloth into thousands of tiny squares, and sold each square for a silver penny. It was the medieval equivalent of printing paper money backed by a spiritual gold standard. By the late 15th century, the financialization of holiness had reached its absolute structural limit. Shrines were no longer just collecting cash at the door. They were tying relic viewings directly into the dark machinery of papal indulgences. An indulgence was an official certificate issued by the Church that promised to reduce a soul's time in purgatory by a specific number of days or years. And how did you earn these precious reductions? By paying a fee to view a collection of sacred relics. This created a hyper-competitive rat race among European rulers to build the largest private relic collections on Earth. Consider Prince Frederick the Wise of Saxony, the ruler of a small German state. Frederick was an obsessive relic investor. He transformed his castle church in Wittenberg into a massive spiritual theme park. By the year 1520, Frederick's personal collection contained exactly 19,013 individual holy relics. His portfolio included 4 hairs from the Virgin Mary, a piece of Jesus' manger, 3 fragments of manna from the desert, and hundreds of complete saintly skeletons dressed in silk. Frederick published an illustrated catalog detailing every item in his collection, complete with the specific purgatory discount assigned to each artifact. If a visiting tourist walked through Frederick's church, paid the required admission fees, and piously viewed every single relic in the collection, they were granted a total purgatory reduction of precisely 1,902,202 years and 270 days. Frederick was charging top silver for these viewings, turning his small town of Wittenberg into a financial powerhouse that rivaled the banking houses of Augsburg. Think about the absurd scale of that financial engine. People were handing over their real, hard-earned silver coins in exchange for abstract mathematical reductions off invisible spiritual sentences, verified by a room full of old bones and pieces of cloth. The profit margins were effectively 100%. The system seemed totally indestructible. The revenue streams were diversified, customer demand was perpetually guaranteed by the fear of eternal damnation, and the regulatory authority, the papacy, was receiving a cut of every major transaction. But inside this hyper-leveraged system of spiritual monetization, a catastrophic structural vulnerability was quietly growing. The system relied entirely on one single asset: absolute, uncritical human trust. The moment the audience began questioning the authenticity of the bones or the moral authority of the sellers, the entire multi-billion-dollar valuation would not just decline, it would vaporize overnight. And in the year 1517, right in the heart of Frederick the Wise's relic empire in Wittenberg, a young, furious monk walked up to the heavy wooden doors of the castle church. His name was Martin Luther. Armed with a hammer, 95 theological arguments, and a burning hatred for the commercial exploitation of faith, Luther nailed his manifesto to the door. The dominoes were about to fall. Luther did not just attack the abstract theology of salvation. He went straight for the revenue model. He publicly called out the indulgence sellers as glorified con artists and mocked the relic trade as a grotesque scam designed to strip poor peasants of their bread money. Luther famously declared that there were enough pieces of the true cross in Europe to build an entire fleet of ships, and that most of the saintly bones worshipped in cathedrals were actually the buried remains of dead pigs and dogs. With the rapid invention of the printing press, Luther's scathing critique spread across Europe like wildfire. Millions of people who had spent their savings buying lead badges and viewing dried bones suddenly experienced a massive shock of realization. The psychological illusion collapsed. Across northern Europe, a wave of iconoclasm exploded. Angry mobs surged into cathedrals, dragged down ancient reliquaries, smashed open the gold caskets, and dumped the contents into local rivers and sewers. Thousands of sacred objects that had been valued at millions of silver coins a week earlier were instantly reduced to worthless rubble and scattered bone dust. Prince Frederick the Wise woke up to discover that his prized portfolio of 19 013 relics, an asset class that had taken decades and vast fortunes to assemble, had lost 100% of its commercial value almost overnight. Nobody was paying silver to view his collection anymore. The local pilgrimage economy collapsed. Hostels closed their doors, badge foundries went bankrupt, and monastic revenues plunged into the abyss. The Protestant Reformation had completely dismantled the greatest spiritual monopoly in human history. Yet, when you step back and examine the structural wreckage of the medieval relic empire, a astonishing historical truth emerges. The physical shrines may have been destroyed in Northern Europe, and the trade in human bones may have faded into history, but the financial mechanics invented by those medieval relic merchants never actually died. They simply evolved. When medieval monasteries created mass-produced lead badges so pilgrims could display their journey, they were establishing the foundational principles of modern travel branding and souvenir merchandise. When cathedral chapters engineered complex travel networks with private tolls, specialized lodging, and entry tickets, they designed the world's very first global tourism infrastructure. And when relic brokers packaged common objects inside elaborate gold cases to charge premium prices based on origin and exclusivity, they wrote the core operational playbook for modern luxury branding and artificial scarcity. You see, you were never really paying for the dried bone inside the glass box. You were paying for a physical anchor to a larger story, a ticket of belonging to a cosmic community, and a tangible promise of hope in a terrifyingly chaotic world. The medieval relic trade showed humanity that if you can successfully weaponize human desire, frame it within an extraordinary narrative, and manufacture artificial scarcity around intangible value, people will gladly rewrite the laws of economics and step right past the gates of hell just to hand you their money.